From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Good day to you all. Welcome again to another episode of The Sculptor's Funeral, the podcast for figurative sculptors around the world. I am your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor and instructor living and working in Florence, where all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself. And today we continue our ongoing discussion of the early Renaissance. Now, as the early Renaissance progresses into the middle of the 15th century, we find a new, younger generation of sculptors who capitalize upon the developments of the previous generation. I mentioned this development in the Luca della Robbia episode a few weeks ago. Luca della Robbia can be counted as one of the younger generation, while Ghiberti and Donatello are the generation that preceded him. Ghiberti and Donatello and others were all breaking new ground in sculpture, opening up new avenues of pursuit, which the next generations then developed into a new aesthetic. And it wasn't just the artists themselves who were changing the landscape, it was also the people who were demanding the art as well, the patrons, people like Cosimo de' Medici. Now, you will recall that at the beginning of the 15th century, you were either making statuary for churches and chapels, or you pretty much weren't working as a sculptor. This gradually changed, however, with the continued rise of the merchant class throughout the 15th century, which brought the growing recognition that art could be a display of personal and family wealth and prestige in the way that a nice palazzo or fine clothing could be. A very prominent example of this trend towards using art as a symbol of personal wealth would be Donatello's bronze David, which was commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici, a personal commission, sometime around 1440, to be placed in his palazzo's courtyard. But there are many other examples of much humbler commissions in the same vein for maybe less memorable clients than Cosimo de' Medici. Local politicians or guild bosses, wealthy merchants, even well-off tradesmen could now afford to own minor devotional objects or decorative art for use in the home. These humbler commissions included busts of saints and prophets, or reliefs in various materials, terracotta, stucco, wood, decorated coats of arms, other decorative motifs, as well as small figures. Again, much of this work was meant to be displayed in the house or maybe in private chapels. Now, along with this proliferation of new but relatively minor clients, there evolved a cadre of minor sculptors and related artisans to fill that need. And I don't mean to use the term minor as a pejorative, but just, not everyone can be a Donatello or a della Robbia. And of course, it's the most natural thing in the world that the generation of artists following a truly great sculptor would produce several imitators and inspire others to take up the art. So think of Donatello as sort of the trunk of a tree, and the proliferation of minor sculptors after him are sort of that tree's branches. We find the same situation in the wake of Michelangelo and Bernini and Rodin. First comes the great genius, and then come the imitators. And interestingly, it's the same pattern we find with patrons, hand in hand with the proliferation of competent second-tier sculptors, all offering competitive prices. A reasonably successful businessman now could emulate the Medici family and commission, say, a terracotta or a plaster bust of the Virgin to add prestige to the family and impress the neighbors. I could list a dozen or more of these sort of second-tier sculptors whose work can be seen in the museums of Florence and beyond, but whose names are much less familiar than the standard list of Renaissance masters. You've got Bernardo and Antonio Rossellino, Gregorio di Lorenzo, Mino da Fiesole, Simone Ferrucci, and on and on and on. All respectable talents who had viable careers but never rose to the rank of Renaissance superstar. And Desiderio da Settignano is one of those names generally found on this list. So why are we talking about Desiderio da Settignano today and not one of the others? Because Desiderio da Settignano was clearly a master, head and shoulders above his peers, but he was cut off in his prime. Desiderio was born around 1430, and he died in 1464. A very brief life indeed, of only 35 years, reminiscent of the short life of a sculptor of the generation before him, Nanni di Banco. And as with Nanni, we can only speculate as to what Desiderio would have accomplished if he had lived as long as Donatello did, who lived to be 80, or Michelangelo, who lived to be 89. Regardless, Desiderio, in his short career of only about 15 years, added significantly to the visual language of the Renaissance, elaborating upon and further refining the mid-century Florentine trend towards visual realism, combined with an aesthetic of elegant sweetness, which in the episode of Luca della Robbia I referred to as dolcezza. But don't take my word for it. Desiderio's talent and the subsequent loss of that talent's promise was noted by his contemporaries and recorded for posterity by Giorgio Vasari in his biography of Desiderio.
He was an imitator of the manner of Donatello, although he had a natural gift of imparting very great grace and loveliness to his heads, and, in the expressions of his women and children, there is seen a delicate, sweet, and charming manner, produced as much by nature, which had inclined him to this, as by the zeal with which he had practised his intelligence in the art. If death had not snatched so prematurely from the world a spirit which worked so nobly, he would have done so much later on, by means of experience and study, that he would have outstripped in art all those whom he had surpassed in grace. Death cut the thread of his life at the age of 28, which caused great grief to those who were looking forward to seeing so great an intellect attain to perfection in old age, and they were left in the deepest dismay at such a loss.
Thank you, Giorgio. And by the way, Vasari, you got Desiderio's age wrong. In fact, he was around 35 and not 28 when he died. And because his professional career was so darn short, it's almost pointless to try to tell the story of Desiderio's art in terms of development or evolution. His whole career was his early period, and he went in a lot of different directions at the same time according to the needs of his clients. His work includes everything from small devotional busts and reliefs, and little statues intended for private chapels in the home, or he also did decorative embellishments for churches, including on the exterior of the Pazzi Chapel in Santa Croce, whose interior was designed by Brunelleschi and decorated by Luca della Robbia. Desiderio's two major works are a wall tomb in the Church of Santa Croce and a tabernacle in the Church of San Lorenzo. Both of those churches, by the way, are here in Florence, a city which Desiderio never seems to have left in his lifetime. But that's jumping ahead a bit. Let's start with the general details of Desiderio's life, and then we'll take a look at a few select works which demonstrate his virtuosity and his variety. Desiderio was from a small village on the outskirts of Florence called Settignano, born into a family populated with masons and stonecutters. Settignano itself was the location of a few stone quarries from which Florence was built. And if you know your Michelangelo history, you may remember that as a very young child, Michelangelo was brought up by a wet nurse in Settignano. And later, Michelangelo was to tell Vasari that he felt his own natural ability came in part from having been raised there in Settignano. When Desiderio turned 23, he matriculated into the Masons Guild as a master in his own right, and then he opened a workshop in the center of Florence, along with his brother, Geri. Yeah, his brother's name was Geri, spelled Geri, which is not so common a name for Italian these days. So you have Desiderio da Settignano and his brother Geri. Okay, so this carving studio, run by these two brothers, was a well-organized little workshop that was geared towards the rather new and novel development of the art market of Florence. Desiderio and Geri worked in wood, terracotta, bronze, and plaster, but Desiderio himself excelled in carving marble and was known principally for his virtuosity in that medium. And Desiderio must have gotten rather good early on, most likely apprenticed to another family of carvers also living in Settignano, headed by Bernardo Rossellino and Bernardo's younger brother Antonio. Now, little information about Desiderio's early training survives, but the opening of his own workshop and his matriculation into the Carvers Guild as a master, they both happen right around the same time Desiderio receives what would become the biggest commission of his career: the wall tomb for Carlo Marsupini, the recently deceased Chancellor of Florence. Now, the job of Chancellor in the Republic of Florence was a political position sort of taking place outside of the group of the Signoria, and this position of Chancellor was usually filled by a scholar or a philosopher. He was sort of like a senior statesman / advisor to the government. And at times, the Chancellery was the most important and influential seat of power in the Republic of Florence. Notable Florentine chancellors included Poggio Bracciolini and Niccolò Machiavelli. And so the tomb of Carlo Marsuppini, the recently dead chancellor, would be placed on the interior wall of the Church of Santa Croce directly from another wall tomb, which was completed only a few years before, for the previous chancellor of Florence, Leonardo Bruni. All right, so you got two chancellors buried in the same church with wall tombs facing each other across the nave. Now, Leonardo Bruni's tomb, the first tomb, was built by none other than Desiderio's probable master, Bernardo Rossellino. And indeed, Desiderio seems to have assisted him on this tomb. And so in terms of analyzing the creativity and style of a particular sculptor by comparing his work to that of his masters, you really can't have a better setup than this, because you can stand right in the middle of the aisle of the church, and just by turning your head, you can directly compare Rossellino's tomb to Desiderio's tomb. And of course, I've made it even easier for you if you just go to thesculptorsfuneral.com and click on the image gallery link for this episode number 46. You can compare the images of these two tombs for yourself. So first, let's take a look at Bernardo Rossellino's tomb for Leonardo Bruni. Now, his stylistic precedents would naturally be the tomb for the antipope, John the 23rd, created by Donatello and Michelozzo just 25 years earlier in Florence. And Bernardo Rossellino would have also, of course, been looking at the classical motifs taken from Roman sarcophagi and Roman monuments, which also influenced, of course, Donatello and Michelozzo's tomb. In both Donatello's and Rossellino's tombs, you've got your sarcophagus with a recumbent effigy figure lying on top of it, sandwiched between two pillars. Right? And on the front of each sarcophagus, there are two angels holding an inscription, and above the sarcophagus, you've got relief panels of the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus. So they're very, very similar in general structure and composition. And the main compositional difference is where in Donatello's tomb, there's a carved marble drapery or canopy spreading out over the top of the monumental tomb, whereas in Rossellino's, the canopy is transformed into a classically inspired yet decorative arch. So it's architecture rather than sort of fake drapery. And on top of Rossellino's architecture, there are two angels, which support the family crest of the deceased Leonardo Bruni. So the main difference between the tombs of Donatello and Rossellino are not in its components, but the way the components were put together. Rossellino's tomb has a coherent, stylistic, and architectural unity that Donatello's clearly lacks. Although Rossellino started out as a sculptor, he devoted himself more and more to architecture, and his understanding of antique architecture and his ability to adapt it to the needs of Florentine humanism makes him one of the architectural heroes of the Renaissance, on a par with Leon Battista Alberti or Michelozzo. In fact, this very tomb of Rossellino's for Leonardo Bruni, it became the gold standard of wall monuments for the rest of the century, which sculptors emulated and admired for its unity between sculpture, decoration, and architecture. Another important aspect of Rossellino's tomb is found in its stylistic content, which directly relates to the humanist nature of the person buried in the tomb. Leonardo Bruni is regarded as the first modern historian, and he was a public speaker in the manner of Cicero, who promoted the idea of a completely secular government and an educated populace. Accordingly, we find very little religious imagery on the tomb of Bruni, apart from the relief of the Virgin and Child. Instead, we find heraldic symbols, lions and eagles, all relating to the civic importance of Bruni and his legacy. The architecture as a whole is very reminiscent of a Roman triumphal arch. In this tomb, we find no allusions to Bruni's heavenly reward of salvation. There's no allegories of faith, hope, and charity, alluding to Bruni's Christian qualities. Instead, we find the inscription on his sarcophagus to be a scrap of poetry done in the manner of a classic ode. And it was written by none other than the man now buried across the aisle from Leonardo Bruni, Carlo Marsuppini, his successor as chancellor. And the inscription reads, quote, well, not quote, I'm paraphrasing because I'm not going to give you the Latin inscription. The inscription reads, "Since Leonardo departed this life, history is mourning, eloquence is mute, and it is said that the muses, both Greek and Latin, could not restrain their tears." Now consider that for a moment. In this little ode, in the inscription on a tomb in a Catholic church, there is no mention of eternal life or salvation, or of Christ or of the Christian God, but of Greek and Latin muses, pagan entities, right there on a tomb in a Christian church. Times were changing in Florence. You know, I'm actually really glad to have the opportunity to mention Bernardo Rossellino. He's someone I think very few of us are familiar with, even his name. He is perhaps a topic for a podcast on architecture rather than sculpture, but if you are into wall tombs in churches, well, then he's your man. He's someone that I became aware of only gradually. You know, every so often in Florence, I would come across an unfamiliar but very impressive and creative tomb, and I would say, wow, who did that? And then I'd read the name Bernardo Rossellino, and then I would think, never heard of him, and then I'd move on. And after I did this about a half dozen times in different churches around Florence over the years, I started to realize, it started to register that these creative tombs were all done by the same guy. And his tombs are actually only a component of his architectural output. He is at least as influential as Desiderio da Settignano was concerning the look and the feel of the Renaissance before Michelangelo hits the scene. And of course, as Desiderio's master, Rossellino was Desiderio's greatest influence. So, anyway, looking across the aisle at Desiderio's tomb of Carlo Marsuppini, Leonardo Bruni's successor as chancellor, we can immediately see that Desiderio's tomb largely takes the form that Rossellino's tomb does, right? You've got the triumphal arch, you've got the sarcophagus, you've got the recumbent effigy, it's all there. Then we start to notice the differences. Those two angels that Rossellino places on top of his arch, well, they've come down in Desiderio's tomb, and they're standing on either side of the sarcophagus. Right? The sarcophagus itself is very, very different from Rossellino's as well. Instead of a simple box tomb with flat sides and right angles, Desiderio has carved an elegantly undulating sarcophagus with rounded corners, covered in elegant floral patterns that in some places are just simple relief, and in others, the foliage lifts off the surface of the tomb and curls and spirals in floral tendrils coming right out into space. And on top of the arch, a large and thin candelabra draped with long festoons of flowers running down the length of the monument is accompanied by two more angels perched, almost dancing, on top of the pilasters. What adds a unique touch of charm to this tomb is the way that Desiderio represents these four angels. These are not the dancing putti of Donatello infused with classical influence. These are little naked kids. They've got scrawny arms, spindly legs, and individualized portraits. The realism of these figures adds a new dimension to tomb sculptures of its type, taking the genre far beyond merely hearkening back to classical antiquity in the way Rossellino's tomb does. And it gives the work a stamp of what we now think of as the Florentine Renaissance aesthetic, much like Luca della Robbia did with his Cantoria, but Desiderio does it in his own way. This realism, in addition to all the other fanciful and light and airy elements like the candelabra, the festoon, the floral designs on the sarcophagus, all these elements all add up and combine in the viewer's eye to provide a distinct feeling of lightness, airiness to the tomb. Some have gone so far to say that the tomb feels playful or almost joyful, but I don't think I'd go that far. But with Desiderio's tomb, commissioned at the very start of his professional career, we see elements of grace and elegance, and above all, lightness, etched into dense and weighty marble. This instinct towards lightness and weightlessness, in both Desiderio's carving style as well as the light-hearted domestic subjects and themes that he was most attracted to in his career, would evolve in his other work to become his artistic signature. The tomb of Carlo Marsuppini took 7 years or so for Desiderio to finish, which ended up being half his career. While working on the tomb during the 1450s, he took on many other commissions, all smaller works, but works which perhaps best fit Desiderio's pursuit of lightness and atmosphere in sculpture. And we're going to take a good look at several of these works when the sculptor's funeral continues. Hey, podcast listeners. The Sculptor's Funeral is made possible by your generous donations, as well as by our sponsor, Blick Art Supplies. That's right, friends, Blick Art Supplies, the largest and oldest provider of art supplies in the United States, shipping their quality wares around the world. Their superior customer service, extensive selection, and competitive prices make them the choice for professional and amateur artists, art educators, architects, designers, students, and hobbyists. Virtually anyone requiring quality art materials for work or for pleasure. And seriously, there isn't another art supplier on the web with as many supplies and materials specifically for sculptors than Blick. It's really huge. They have over 70,000 products for artists of all types. You can get everything you need, from dozens of different clays and plasters to fine Italian marble carving tools, clay modeling tools, specialty casting mediums, body casting supplies, turntables, armatures, books on sculpture, you name it. If you need it for sculpture, they got it. And shipping is free in the U.S. for most items if your order is over $100. But Blick is not merely a place to buy stuff. Their sales staff and product information specialists are trained to hunt down answers to your tough questions regarding materials, techniques, and safety. Hundreds of Blick videos are also available at dickblick.com and on YouTube, including video lesson plans for teachers and product demonstrations for artists. And best of all, by buying your art supplies from Blick, you contribute directly to the support of the Sculptor's Funeral podcast. All you need to do is this. Go to the podcast website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, and click on any of the banner links that you see there. And that will take you right to the Blick website where you can buy whatever you need. It's that simple. Just remember that you need to click through a link on thesculptorsfuneral.com first so that Blick knows I sent you. And so the next time you stock up on armature wire, mold rubber, modeling tools, and plastilina, do it in a way that supports the only podcast out there devoted to the global community of figurative sculpture. Go to thesculptorsfuneral.com and click on Blick and support the show. Thanks. So, we've heard that Desiderio da Settignano had a short life and an early career of only about 15 years, and that career began with a major tomb monument which took him the first half of his career to finish. Lots of other work came his way, though, and Desiderio and his workshop he shared with his brother was constantly active. Notably, Desiderio seems to have garnered the respect and friendship of Donatello himself, by now an old man, but still artistically active. At Donatello's suggestion, Desiderio was given the commission to carve an ornate marble pedestal on which Donatello's bronze David was to stand, and the two sculptors most likely collaborated on a statue of St. John the Baptist for the wealthy Martelli family. Now, the statue is known as the Martelli St. John, and for a long time, opinion has been pretty evenly divided as to whether this work was by Donatello alone, or Desiderio alone, or a collaboration between the two. The problem with attributing the Martelli St. John to one or the other, or to both, is that all the written evidence, going all the way back to Vasari, but to several other sources as well, all the written evidence attributes the Martelli St. John to being a work by Donatello. But the statue itself not only doesn't look like a Donatello, it totally looks like a Desiderio da Settignano. Now, some speculate that the Martelli family themselves put out the idea that it was by Donatello to, increase their family prestige, and that Vasari was just repeating what he had heard. The statue itself was in the hands of the Martelli family and out of the eyes of the public until the 20th century, and so art historians would just generally go on Vasari's word for its attribution. But since its acquisition by the Italian state about a century ago, many historians have raised valid questions and doubts as to whether this statue could possibly have been created by Donatello without Desiderio's involvement. Well, leaving that question open, let's turn our attention to a few different genres of sculpture that Desiderio and his workshop seemed to excel in. Having just mentioned Donatello, we'll start with Desiderio's foray into a genre pioneered by Donatello, that of staccato relief. Staccato relief, as I've mentioned in previous podcasts, is a highly complex, very subtle form of relief that is capable of giving a convincing illusion of a much greater three-dimensionality and depth than other forms of relief, like low relief or high relief. The secret to the creation of staccato is that the volumes of the various forms in the relief, they're not flattened, but rather compressed. And by compressed, I mean that each projection of form is reduced relative to the projecting forms around it. So I guess you would say the ratio of relative projecting forms remains constant and relative to the fully three-dimensional model. And all this means is that when struck by a light source, the compressed relief, even though it's only millimeters deep, casts the same shadow pattern that is found when the same light strikes the fully three-dimensional form. Now, we all comprehend visual form from the patterns of light and shadow falling on that form, right? That's why sculpture is one of the visual arts. So if you're able to replicate a three-dimensional shadow pattern in a relief, that relief will give the illusion of three-dimensional form. Of course, all reliefs will cast shadows of some sort, and often a sculptor working in low relief will hit it just right, and a convincing illusion of depth is obtained. But it wasn't until Donatello that the principles behind this exploitation of shadow in relief was understood and fully utilized. It's sort of like the development of perspective in painting, right? Lots of early painters got certain things right in their attempts at perspective, but it wasn't until Brunelleschi came along that the process and principle was fully understood. Now, unfortunately, Leon Battista Alberti didn't record Donatello's staccato principles like he did Brunelleschi's perspective principles, so Donatello's method can only really be speculated at, and most of what we know about it comes from the reliefs themselves. So how can you tell, by looking at a relief, if the principles of staccato are being applied? Well, most usually, when a sculptor's work is being created by replicating light and shadow, rather than just filling in outlines like in low relief, or attaching figures to a background plane like in high relief, not only is there a complete unity to the shadow patterns across the entire relief in staccato, but a real telltale sign is that the background plane of the relief seems to disappear into the ether. For example, take a look at the Parthenon frieze, or even the Gates of Paradise by Ghiberti. Even when Ghiberti is at his best rendering visual perspective in his relief, the background plane is palpable. But now let's take a look at a work by Donatello, in which you can do at the image gallery for this episode. Donatello's St. George and the Dragon, the first known example of staccato relief, is less than 2 centimeters deep, yet its background plane seems to lie in the far distance. We don't feel as though the figures and forms are stuck onto a back plane. And in Donatello's relief of the Ascension, we see that some of the figures themselves fade away into the atmosphere of the scene, blending imperceptibly into the background plane without ever giving the sense of finite depth which we find in Ghiberti's work. We don't see the plane. We see the far distance the plane implies. This sense of atmosphere, this sense of indeterminate depth, is one of the hallmarks of staccato. And it's Desiderio's ability to render this sense as well as, or dare I say, sometimes better than Donatello, that earns him the label from Vasari as a follower of Donatello. Taking a look at Desiderio's works such as the Folk Madonna, the Panciatichi Madonna, and the relief known as Christ and St. John the Baptist as children, we find the same subtleties of modeling and attention to atmosphere. In the Christ and St. John as children, Christ's shoulder fades into the depth of the relief almost to the point of invisibility. And in works such as these, it's almost as though the image is created using applications of light and shadow rather than applications of form and volume. I took some photos of the Panciatichi Madonna a few weeks ago. It's here in Florence. And I took photos from the proper viewing angle, from the front, but also from the side. So you can see, by a comparison of the two images, just how convincing the illusion of depth is in this work, which is less than an inch deep. We'll talk more about Desiderio's reliefs, including his most famous one, and much more when the sculptor's funeral continues. Hi everyone! I just wanted to let everyone know that now is the time to start planning for the Wiltshire Workshop 2016. Last summer, I conducted a 2-week workshop in the stunning English countryside not far from Stonehenge, and we all had such a good time learning to carve marble that we're going to do it all again. So join me in a 2-week class for beginning and intermediate marble carvers in the green countryside of Wiltshire, just outside of Marlborough, where you'll learn everything you need to know in order to carve a figurative work in marble. In addition to learning the basics with hand tools and machine tools, you will learn the process of using a pointing machine, the simple device which has for centuries enabled sculptors to make exact copies of plaster casts in marble. And that's just what you'll do. Choose from a selection of plaster casts taken from the work of master sculptors of the past, Bernini, Houdon, Michelangelo, and more. Create your very own true and faithful copy in marble to keep. Not many people can claim to own their own mask of Bernini's St. Teresa or Michelangelo's Dying Captive rendered in Carrara marble, and even fewer have carved it for themselves. But you can be one of them. And the workshop just isn't for sculptors with experience. Even complete beginners and non-sculptors can create a work of marble in this 2-week course. We proved that last year. All the information for the Wiltshire Workshop, which starts August 8th, can be found at our website, thesculptorsfuneral.com. There's space for 12 on this workshop, and the sign-up deadline is June 1st, but I have a feeling the course is going to fill up early this year, based on the success of last year's course. So sign up today at thesculptorsfuneral.com or contact me for more details. The Wiltshire Workshop 2016. Become one of the few figurative marble sculptors out there and follow in the footsteps of the old masters. Check it all out on thesculptorsfuneral.com, and I'll see you in Wiltshire. Okay, so let's mention one more relief before moving on. Desiderio da Settignano's most famous relief isn't actually a fully staccato relief. Rather, it's a mixture of high and staccato, and it's known as Young St. John the Baptist. It's known to many of you, probably. It's a very, very popular plaster cast and available commercially. And it's in the Young St. John that we find all the attributes of Desiderio's talents: the charm, the grace, the close visual observation, and the virtuoso handling. If you had to pick a quintessential work of Desiderio, or maybe even a quintessential work of this period of the Florentine Renaissance, it might be this work. Interestingly, the Young Baptist isn't carved in marble, but in a stone called Pietra Serena, which is a blue-gray stone from Settignano, from which the streets of Florence today are paved. This relief of the Young Baptist is typical also of the type of subject Desiderio preferred, and a theme he excelled in: the portrayal of youth. From the adolescent angels on Marsuppini's tomb to the handful of infant Jesuses and young St. Johns he made, Desiderio had no equal in representing prepubescence in sculpture. Some of you might be familiar with the internet meme that makes the rounds every once in a while, usually called Ugly Renaissance Babies. I think there's even a website, like uglyrenaissancebabies.com or something. And it's a website that collects unfortunate representations of youth from painting and sculpture from the 14th through the 16th centuries. Well, with Desiderio, the age of ugly Renaissance babies comes to a thankful end. Given Desiderio's two main talents, a light, airy grace and a keen eye for naturalistic rendering, it's no surprise that his most endearing and enduring work comes in the form of his child subjects. And that leads us into another genre of sculpture for Desiderio, the portrait bust. As with his reliefs, Desiderio produced many busts of children in various ages, both as portraits and as adorable little collectible sculptures. In the wake of Donatello, it's difficult to find a sculptor inventing or resurrecting a genre of sculpture that Donatello didn't do first. But Desiderio gets full credit for producing the first child portrait busts since antiquity. Desiderio was also the greatest master of the genre, inspiring and influencing others as far-flung as Jean-Antoine Houdon in the 18th century and the Neo-Florentine movement in the 19th century. So to be clear, obviously, children were a common sight in sculpture at the time, but in the form of classicized baby angels, or putti, or sometimes called spiritelli. Donatello, for instance, sculpted plenty of putti, as did many others, but Desiderio takes the genre from a decorative motif steeped in classicism to a standalone bust in the round, whose purpose was to catch the life and emotion of a young child. Giving tremendous liveliness and fidelity to nature to these busts, Desiderio takes the genre further than even the ancient Romans did, whose portraits of youth are as stoic and as expressionless as the Roman portraits of adults. Desiderio's children, ranging from 1 to 5 years old, are depicted as alert, lively little tykes, some smiling, one notably laughing openly, a hugely difficult subject to do justice to. For me, Desiderio's child portraits are his masterpieces. The fidelity to nature in them are just stunning. His handling of the surfaces and textures, while they're typical of his best work, Desiderio often employed a very, very high polish to his marble, which heightens the feeling of light and movement that I've never quite encountered in others' work in precisely the same way. The simplicity and virtuosity of these child portraits are such that they are sometimes mistaken for 19th century works rather than 15th century sculpture. And this common mistake only highlights how influential Desiderio was among many sculptors of the 19th century, who turned to the masters of the early Renaissance in search of an aesthetic that wasn't bound up in the chokehold of classicism, which dominated sculpture from the time of Michelangelo until the time of Canova. And of course, Desiderio's naturalism and virtuosity also served him well as a portraitist of adults. The first true portrait bust thought to have been done in Florence, which also would have been the first portrait bust since antiquity, is generally attributed to Donatello, and it's of a prominent Florentine banker and politician named Niccolò d'Auzzano. Now, if you have studied in an atelier or any other art school that has you learn to draw from plaster casts, you know this bust. He's got a bald head, big eye sockets, and big ears that don't really seem to line up too well. You know the bust. I've heard both students and teachers refer to this plaster bust as the Niccolò, or sometimes just the Donatello. But here's the thing. In the last decade, art historians have decided that this bust of Niccolò d'Auzzano is more likely to be by the hand of Desiderio da Settignano. But this is only the latest consensus in a debate about this bust that has been going on for over a century. The debate not only argues about who made the bust, but also when, and there's even the question as to whether or not it's even of Niccolò d'Auzzano. Can we even say for sure that it's the first portrait bust since antiquity, regardless of who sculpted it? And the answer to that question depends on how you define a portrait. Because here's the thing. If Donatello did this bust, if he worked it up from life, from using the live sitter, presumably in the 1420s, then yes, it's the first portrait bust. But if this work is by Desiderio, it wouldn't have been sculpted until the early 1450s, at the earliest, right? But Niccolò d'Auzzano died in 1431, when Desiderio was still in diapers. So Desiderio never even met or saw Niccolò. Some would argue that the bust shouldn't be called a portrait bust if the sculptor never saw what the subject looked like for himself. The bust is more of a commemorative bust, not a true portrait bust. After all, Donatello did sculpt a bust of a saint, San Rosore, way back in the 1420s, and he never met that saint. And no one calls that the first portrait bust, even though, stylistically and formally, it's certainly a bust, and the earliest one produced in the Renaissance. So if the San Rosore by Donatello isn't a portrait bust, then a bust of Niccolò done by Desiderio isn't one either. And it's maybe just a pointless argument of semantics at the end of the day. Anyway, personally, I think there are some weirdnesses in the face of the d'Auzzano bust that seem to fit Donatello's style more than Desiderio, but I'm no expert. And I also don't know why the Auzzano family would commission a bust of an ancestor 20 years after he died. To me, that just seems strange, especially considering that, portraiture hadn't really been reinvented until then. It seems odd. Anyway, leaving behind that debate, as we must, let's turn back to Desiderio's portraits and note that he was one of the first sculptors, beginning in the 1450s, to revive the art of the portrait bust generally. He had a rival sculptor in the form of Mino da Fiesole, who also began to create portrait busts in the 1450s, notably the members of the Medici family. These two sculptors, Desiderio and Mino da Fiesole, create portraits with a very different feel from your average Roman portrait bust. In fact, from the outset, the Florentine portrait bust of the 1550s appears to be born of a fully Florentine aesthetic, rather than an emulation of or an evolution from the antique. Instead of busts being truncated at the neck, as in a Roman portrait, the bodies are continued past the shoulders and are truncated horizontally, and the truncation itself forms the base of the portrait. Also, generally the busts are in contemporary dress. And when the Roman-style togas and drapery are employed in these Florentine busts, which is comparatively rare, it's done in conscious emulation of the antique as a symbol of power and prestige. A few of the most excellent busts from Desiderio would include his terracotta portrait, known as the Young Deacon, his polychromed wood and stucco portrait, known as La Belle Florentine, and his marble portrait of a lady, said to be a portrait of Marietta Strozzi. Now, one of the oddities of Florentine portraits of the 1550s is that very few of them come down to us with positive identities attached. These portraits were made for private families, often portraits of family members who may not have attained notoriety or fame in their lifetime. And these portraits stayed in the private collections of these families, sometimes for centuries, and eventually their original identity is forgotten or disputed. Or the works are sold off to collectors who value them more for their artistry rather than their identity, and their names get lost that way. There was a bust of Marietta Strozzi mentioned by Vasari as being carved by Desiderio, and scholars are pretty sure which one Vasari is talking about, but no one is really positive, and even less so about the others. So these three portraits, the so-called Young Deacon in terracotta, the one known as La Belle Florentine in polychromed wood and stucco, and the marble Marietta Strozzi, these three works fully illustrate the technical and stylistic range of Desiderio da Settignano. What perhaps is more striking than their range is what these three portraits share in common: a subtle inner psychology touched with grace, intelligence, and sweetness. That je ne sais quoi of mid-century dolcezza permeates these works, and does so with a quiet confidence that can only come from the hands of a master. Desiderio da Settignano's work, along with the work of Mino da Fiesole and Luca della Robbia, all are like a calming and tranquil resolution after the active and ambitious striving of the first generation of the Renaissance. The peaceful and domestic nature of this mid-century work is like a counterpoint to the creative cauldron of what came before, giving us today the sense of an artistic and aesthetic culture that has fully come into its own and that no longer has anything to prove to anyone. The Renaissance has firmly taken root, and Luca, Mino, and Desiderio are its first flowers. Well, I want to thank you all for listening once again. So yeah, I'm really excited about being able to do the Wiltshire Workshop again up in the UK this summer. I had a fantastic time last year. Met some really great people, some of whom might be listening to my voice right now. And this year is going to be just as good as last, if not better. Oh, and by the way, I made a little video about the Wiltshire Workshop, so you can check it out at The Sculptor's Funeral. It's also at the YouTube channel, The Sculptor's Funeral, and it's also on our Facebook group page, so check it out. It'll give you an idea of what the marble carving course is all about. And while you are there, if you go to the Facebook group page, don't forget you can join in the conversation. You can ask a question, leave a comment about the podcast or about sculpture in general. You can post current events or interesting articles and much more. You can also subscribe to the podcast at Stitcher Mobile or on iTunes, or subscribe from any service from which you get your podcasts and receive the podcast automatically on your PC, tablet, or mobile device every week. Check out the sculptorsfuneral.com website where you can stream the complete archives of the show without having to subscribe to anything and for free. You can check out the image galleries for this and for every other episode, and you can click on the sponsor of the podcast, Blick Art Supplies, and doing so supports the podcast. And for that, I thank you. Thanks again for listening, and have a productive week.